Hey everyone, my name is Anil, and in this video, we're going to do a quick overview of where an LLM call suffices versus where you need RAG. So, as we know, LLM or large language models are very good at text generation tasks, right? They're the greater language. So, anything that involves text generation, including things like writing code, LLMs are good at. Now, the typical, easy use case is where you give it a query, say, write me a story or write me a line of code, give it some instructions. I want it to be these many words in this style and so on. And the LLM, given that information, does its job, right? And models like this are very good at writing, reasoning, summarizing, anything that involves language and text. Now, when you give it a simple task like this, even things like write me a line of code, you're depending on the LLM's intrinsic knowledge, right? The model, which is a deep learning model, a large neural network, has been trained on a lot of data. Models today have trillions of parameters trained on almost every piece of information out there, and so you're depending on the LLM to kind of based on the training parameters stored, give you a response. What is the issue here? Well, first of all, LLMs are not deterministic. Depending on the query, the answers can vary. And also, training an LLM, especially large models, is very expensive, very time consuming, which means there's a knowledge cutoff. The last time the model was trained could be 6 months ago, which means if you ask it a query about something after that, the LLM does not have an answer, and it might make one up, which is what is called hallucination. Also, the LLM does not have access to your personal documents, right? So you have a company, you have internal documentation, you have your own reports, and you want the LLM to answer questions about that. What do you do in that case? Well, we're not yet, at RAG. What you can do is in the context, apart from the query and instructions, you can add the document, right? Extract the document, if say it's a PDF, extract the entire pieces of information and pass the entire thing to the LLM. So this is not RAG, this is just giving it a large amount of context. What's the problem with this? Well, say you have, one or many large documents, say 100 pages, 200 pages. Well, the amount of information you can give the LLM is constrained by its context window size, which is the maximum number of tokens that the LLM can process as input. So if you have too much information, you can't pass the entire thing to the LLM. Even if you can, unless the entire report or the entire document base is required, LLMs can get confused with, the larger the amount of information you give it, it is just going to take the entire thing and run with it, right? It's not going to do a search by itself, which means you can again lead to inaccurate answers, a lot of confusion. Then of course there's the simple, aspect of cost. The larger the input context, as you know, LLMs are charged per token. You have large input context, you have large number of tokens, and so cost goes up. And if it's a one-off use case, you're okay. But if you have, this is a repeated use case, you're a large company with lots of people consistently querying data, so you're doing financial reports and stuff, you're analyzing it, you're asking queries every day. Suddenly now you have lots of users, lots of chats, each time all the documents are being passed in, it's not scalable at all. And so in this kind of scenario where you have internal or documentation that you want the LLM to use, but it's going to become very expensive, you start using RAG or retrieval augmented generation. Where now what is happening is you're actually, instead of passing the entire knowledge base that you have, you're retrieving the relevant pieces of information and only adding that to the context. And how is that done? Well, you have a knowledge base when it started out, it was typically a vector store, but now there are different ways of handling the storage pipeline. You could have knowledge graphs, you could use keyword search and so on. But basically, all the information you have, the different pieces of information, are broken down into chunks or pieces and then stored in a database, which is queryable by different types of parameters, right? So when you ask the LLM a query, right, first, actually, if RAG is enabled or RAG, you're using a RAG framework, the relevant chunks of information are first extracted from that knowledge base, right? Let's say a vector store. And only those pieces, so only the relevant information is then passed in, added to context or augmented to the context and passed into the LLM. So now what happens, context windows become less of a constraint because typically you're not going to pass in that much information. You're only passing in what is required or what is relevant, which also reduces the amount of confusion, assuming your, retrieval pipeline is well set up. And you can have multiple strategies working at the same time. So hybrid RAG, where you use keyword search plus graph plus, a vector search, but you make sure all the relevant context is provided so there's less confusion. The LLM knows this is what I need to work on. And of course, that reduces the cost, right, per call, because now, say you have a financial report, you want to ask about different pieces of information. Each time you're only sending in that relevant chunk, you're not sending everything in. That means you have multiple users and multiple queries per day. The cost is still fairly stable, making it scalable. But also, as your knowledge base evolves, that becomes possible. You can keep adding information to the knowledge base, but without worrying too much about the cost. Only the relevant pieces are added in, which means for internal knowledge bases, again, you look at a financial, an analytics company that looks at stock data. You keep adding annual reports and so on. It still doesn't really impact the cost. So that means that with RAG, scale becomes possible for internal knowledge bases. So hopefully this has given you a good understanding of how RAG becomes important and in what conditions, and where just an LLM call will suffice.